Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In his short lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, Jean-Paul Sartre brings up three terms which he calls grandiloquent: anguish, forlornness, and despair, or in the original French, angoisse, délaissement, and désespoir. Each of these is a vital characteristic, you could say, of the human condition. Sartre is not saying that they're actually part of human nature because, of course, from the existentialist point of view, as he articulates it, human nature is something that we ourselves determine. Existence precedes essence, but each of these, you could say, is a dimension of the inescapable human condition. So there is something that does apply to all humanity, and he provides an explanation of what he means by each of these terms in the course of the lecture. As he actually says, as you will see, it's all quite simple. So he's suggesting that anybody can grasp these. So he says, let's take anguish first. The existentialists at once say altogether that man, or the human being, is anguish. And another way of translating anguish is anxiety. This is coming from the Angst that is referenced by Heidegger. Anguish, anxiety, these sort of things overlap with each other to some degree in English. And why do we feel, or why are we, you could say, shot through with anxiety so that it's really at the core of who we are? It has to do with the fact that we cannot evade the responsibility of self-determinative choice. That is, choice where we decide not only what we're going to do, but why we're going to do it, and what we're not going to do, and what our priorities are, and what kind of person we are. That's how we make use of ourselves. So Sartre says that the person who involves themselves and who realizes that they're not only the person they choose to be, but also a lawmaker, in effect, who is at the same time choosing all humankind as well as themselves, and we'll come back to that in just a moment, cannot escape the feeling of the total and deep responsibility. Why is Sartre talking about making decisions not just for oneself, but for everybody else? That's part of the nature of human decision. We are affirming, like it or not, our stance as the stance that not only we should take, but any reasonable person or everybody should take. And Sartre acknowledges that there's plenty of people who are like, I'm not expecting everybody else to act like that. And as a matter of fact, I hope that they don't. Like when they're stealing something, the thief doesn't want to be stolen from. You can say there's a sort of performative or inherent contradiction there. But according to Sartre, within the core of that person's being, there is this anxiety that leads them to have to repress it and ignore the fact that they could have chosen otherwise, and that they could be choosing something that's better. He said, there's no escaping this disturbing thought except by a kind of double dealing. A person who lies and makes excuses for themselves by saying, not everybody does that, is someone with an uneasy conscience, because the act of lying implies that a universal value is conferred upon the lie. So we're always in anxiety. We always have to make decisions. Even if we choose not to make a decision, we're still making a decision. You can't get away from that until you're dead. That's the basis of human being is decision, choosing. Oftentimes without knowing the full situation that you're choosing in, right? So we either feel that anxiety or we conceal it from ourselves. We repress it. We bury it within. He says anguish is evident even when it does conceal itself. And he brings up the example of Abraham. He also talks about this woman who is hearing hallucinations. Someone would speak to her on the telephone and give her orders. Her doctor asked, who is it who's talking to you? And she said, well, it's God. And then what proof, Sartre says, do I have that it is God? If an angel comes to me, what proof is it that it's an angel? If I hear voices, what proof is there that they come from heaven and not from hell or from the subconscious or a pathological condition? I'm the one who chooses that interpretation, and I am responsible for that choice. So I can't get away from that. I can't get away from the anxiety of having to choose over and over and over again. Even if I make a commitment, I say, okay, I'm going to make this choice once and for all, I still have to keep making that commitment, or rather remaking that commitment, re-choosing every time that there's a possibility for me to go somewhere else with it. So we can't evade choices, and the choices that we make are within determinate circumstances. We don't entirely determine the very condition for our choosing. He has the example here of a military leader who takes the responsibility for an attack and sends a certain number of men to their death. He chooses to do so, and he alone makes the choice for the most part. Orders come from above, but the orders are always too broad. He has to interpret them, and he says in making a decision, he cannot help feeling a certain anguish. All leaders know this anguish. This does not keep them from acting. On the contrary, it's the very condition of their acting. A lot of people want to say, well, I'm not going to make a decision until everything's perfectly clear. No, you actually do have to make a decision, and you have to bear the responsibility for it. The next thing that he talks about is forlornness, délaissement, and what he means by this is he formulates it in one quick way of expressing it. There is no a priori good. When it comes to our decision making, there is nothing that is out there in the world or coming down to us from on high or within ourselves, speaking, with a still voice of conscience or anything like that, that gives us an automatic, here's your answer. There's nothing like that. And the only reason, according to Sartre, why we think that there is because we convince ourselves of that. We use our freedom to tell ourselves that there's this thing conditioning our freedom. He frames it in terms of we mean that God does not exist and we have to face all the consequences of this. Why bring up God? Well, if God did exist and God's statements were clear, of course, for many religious people, the fact that God exists does not clear up everything. It actually complicates things. But let's go with Sartre on this. If God did exist, then there would be some sort of hierarchy of values or imperatives or whatever it happens to be that we could rely upon completely and follow out. And human beings would have a determinate nature because they would be created by God with that very nature, and we could examine it and figure it out. So, this is a rejection of not only divine command theories, but also natural law theories and many other ethical theories as well. So he's rejecting religious ethics, any sort of ethics that would base itself upon God said or God did or anything referencing God. He's also rejecting a lot of secular ethics, and he talks about a certain kind of secular ethics popular in France in the 1800s, also back in the 1700s to some extent among the Enlightenment philosophers, but especially in the 1800s, and going down to Sartre's own time, that says that God is a useless and costly hypothesis. We're going to discard it. But in order for there to be an ethics, a society, a civilization, it's essential certain values be taken seriously and that they be considered as having an a priori existence. It must be obligatory a priori, that is before any experience, sort of a universal condition for humankind, to be honest, not to lie, not to beat your wife, to have children, etc., etc. And, what Sartre sees this as doing is basically trying to have your God cake, have your not God cake, and eat it too, right? You're trying to get the same sort of thing out of philosophy or science or some other scheme that religious people got out of it. And Sartre says, no, we have to take it seriously. If there is no God, then as Dostoevsky says, everything is permitted. We have to acknowledge that there's this wide range of possibility and variability, and we don't get any sort of criteria that we can rely upon as an absolute starting point for ethics. So he says there's no fixed and given human nature that we could rely upon. We can't look within and, as natural law theorists say, use reason to examine our impulses. We can't, inclinations, so that we can figure out, well, life is to be protected. We have to educate our children. We should learn the truth. No, those may be true, but we have to make them true. We have to choose them. We can't just say, oh, well, I've got the answers. Now I need just to apply it. So no fixed and given human nature. Sartre also says there is no determinism, and here this could easily be misunderstood. He doesn't mean that if I drop this book, it won't fall to the earth, not just 9 times out of 10, but guaranteed, or all the other things that we think are deterministic. But the human being is constantly emerging out of the causal deterministic nexus and then using their freedom and coming back into it with the nexus being changed as a result. So we can't claim any sort of determinism, whether it be an individual one of, well, I've got the genes that caused me to be this way, or my environment made me this way. We can't talk about it in terms of larger social determinisms. Well, I was born into poverty, so I had to behave this way, or I was born into the house with the proverbial silver spoon in my mouth as a rich person, so I have to see things this way. Sartre says, no, those are cop-outs. We always do choose. There is no determinism that decides for us how we're going to choose. We choose to make that determinism deterministic in our choices. We are the ones who say, oh, well, Freud says that I have this complex, or the CBT therapist says I have to look at things this way, or pick whatever other psychological or sociological or whatever other theory you want. We're the ones who take that on and decide to act that way. He criticizes as well the appeal to passion. He says, the existentialist does not believe in the power of passion. He will never agree that a sweeping passion is a ravaging torrent which fatally leads a man to certain acts and therefore is an excuse. He thinks that the human being is responsible for their passion. So whether that passion be that of revenge or that of love, that of sorrow, that of anxiety, it's what we do with our emotions that decides our actions, not the emotions sweeping us along and making us follow in their course. He says that sort of romanticism or that sort of fatalism is something that we choose. It's not something that we can take as an a priori. He also says there's no signs that we could appeal to, like a sign from God or the universe, or pick whatever you want, karma in some vague, new agey sense. We are the ones who choose to see them as signs. We are the ones who interpret them as signs. There's no getting away from that. That is why we are forlorn. We don't have anything that solves the question of life and the questions of choices and actions for us. We have to choose. So you can see how forlornness and anguish go along together. The third condition that Sartre talks about is another condition for our choices and actions, and that is what he calls despair. And it's a little bit misnamed, right? This sends a very pessimistic message because of its connotations, both in the French, désespoir, and in the English, despair. But all he means by despair is that we ourselves are the ones who have to provide everything. We can count on the world to some extent. He talks about probabilities. He says we have to confine ourselves to reckoning only with what depends on our will, or on the ensemble of probabilities which make our action possible. What do we actually have any say in? I won't even say control over, but say in. What we choose. And then this penumbra of possibilities that surround us. They may cooperate with us. They may totally overturn us. So the existentialist can say, for example, you're out in the middle of the ocean, the boat goes down, you manage to get into one of the lifeboats, and now the lifeboat, you're close to shore, but it's a pretty rough sea, and you're like, well, I think I better start swimming, right? Rather than just simply cling to the lifeboat. You choose to get out there, the waves may not cooperate with you, you may die. There's nothing that says, oh, well, if you just put it out there into the universe will respond to you. No, the universe may crush you down, right? Or it could be other human beings who are not going to cooperate with you. A great example of this is in Sartre's famous short story, The Wall. Nobody there is really able, except for the narrating character, to evade their execution because other people want to execute them. And the only thing that saves him is a stroke of luck. All we can count on is ourselves, and then perhaps some cooperation from the rest of the world, as he says. When we want something, he says, we have to reckon with probabilities. I may be counting, for example, on the arrival of a friend. The friend is coming by rail or streetcar. This supposes how many different things? The train arrives on schedule. The streetcar will not jump the track. The moment the possibilities I am considering are not rigorously involved by my action, I ought to, he says, disengage myself from them, because no God, no scheme can adapt the world and its possibilities to my will. And he considers a response from one of the main movements of the time, the Marxists, who say, well, if you're doing the right thing, you can count on the workers, the proletariat, to see your project further. And Sartre says, no, you can't. Why not? Because they are also free human beings like myself. They could choose next week to all become fascists. That's the example that he uses. You can't count on a movement. You can't count on some sort of program. You can't count on anything to necessarily see your action through. And so does that keep you from acting? No, of course not. You still have to act, but you do it in despair, knowing that your action may be totally ineffective, knowing that other people may misinterpret it, because that is the possibility for their choices. So we have these three fundamental dimensions or characteristics of the human condition being narrated here. You see how all three of them fit into each other: anguish, forlornness, and despair.